On Christmas Eve in 1945, a house fire struck tragedy to a family of 10. Only the remains of 5 of the children were never found. Welcome to Something Strange. Our story begins with a man named George Sodder, who was born in Tula, Sardinia, Italy in 1895. 13 years later, he immigrated to the United States and eventually found work on the railroads in Pennsylvania, essentially carrying water and other supplies to workers. Eventually, after a few years, he took more permanent work as a driver in Smithers, West Virginia. He then started his own trucking company, initially hauling fill dirt to construction sites and later hauling coal mined in the region. It was around this time that he met Jenny Cipriani, a storekeeper's daughter in Smithers, West Virginia, who had also immigrated from Italy in her childhood and would later become his wife. The Sodders eventually settled outside nearby Fayetteville, West Virginia, which had a large population of Italian immigrants. They resided in a 2-story timber frame house 2 miles north of town. In 1923, they had the first of their 10 children. George's business prospered, and they became, quote, one of the most respected middle-class families around, in the words of one local official. The last of the Sodder children, Sylvia, was born in 1943, and by then their second oldest son, Joe, 21, had left home to serve in the military during World War II. After celebrating Christmas Eve in 1945, the fate of the family would take a turn for the worse. The facts at this point were 9 of the 10 Sodder children, again the oldest son was away in the army, all went to bed on Christmas Eve. After that, their mother Jenny was awoken 3 times. First, it was at 12:30 a.m. when she was awoken by a phone call during which she could hear a man's voice as well as glasses clinking in the background. She then went back to bed, only to be startled by a loud bang and a rolling noise on the roof. Soon after, she dozed off again and finally awoke an hour later to see the house engulfed in smoke. George, Jenny, and 4 of the Sodder children, toddler Sylvia, teenagers Marion and George Jr., as well as 23-year-old John, escaped. Marion ran to a neighbor's house to call the Fayetteville Fire Department, but did not get a response, prompting another neighbor to go looking for Fire Chief F.J. Morris. In the hours spent waiting for help, George and Jenny tried every imaginable way to rescue their children, but their efforts were mysteriously thwarted. George's ladder was missing and neither of his trucks would start, and help did not arrive until 8 a.m., even though the fire department was just 2 miles away from the Sodder home. At the time, the police inspector said that the cause of the fire was faulty wiring, although George and Jenny wanted to know how that was possible given that there was no previous issues with the electricity. They were also curious why there was no remains among the ashes. Chief Morris said that the blaze had cremated the bodies, but a crematorium worker told Jenny that the bones remain even after bodies are burned at 2,000 degrees for 2 hours. The Sodder home only took 45 minutes to burn to the ground. The firefighters, one of whom was a brother of Jenny's, could do little but look through the ashes that were left in the Sodders' basement. By 10 a.m., Chief Morris told the Sodders that they had not found any bones, as might have been expected if the other children were in the house. Chief Morris told George to leave the site undisturbed so that the state fire marshal's office could conduct a more thorough investigation. However, after 4 days, George and his wife could not bear the site anymore, so he bulldozed 5 feet of dirt over the site with the intention of converting it to a memorial garden for the lost children. The next day, the local coroner convened an inquest, which held that the fire was an accident caused by faulty wiring. On December 30th, death certificates for the 5 children were issued. The local newspaper contradicted itself, stating that all the bodies had been found, but then later in the same story reported that only one part of one body was recovered. On January 2nd, 1946, a funeral was held, but George and Jenny were too grief-stricken to attend, although the surviving children did. At first, it appeared that this was the end of the story, although it is only the beginning, as George and Jenny became convinced that their 5 children were still alive. They began questioning why, if it was an electrical problem, that the family's Christmas lights had remained on throughout the fire's early stages. Then, they found a ladder that had been missing from the side of the house on the night of the fire at the bottom of an embankment 75 feet away. A telephone repairman told the Sodders that the house's phone line had not been burned through in the fire as they had initially thought, but cut by someone who had been willing and able to climb 14 feet up the pole and reach 2 feet away from it to do so. A man whom neighbors had seen stealing a block and tackle from the property around the time of the fire was identified and arrested. He claimed that he had been the one that cut the phone line, thinking it was a power line, but denied having anything to do with the fire. But Jenny said in 1968 that if he had cut the power line, she and her husband, along with the other 4 children, would have never been able to make it out of the house. Also strangely, there's no record identifying the suspect exists and why he would have wanted to cut any utility lines to the Sodder house while stealing the block and tackle has never been explained. And this also led the Sodders to believe that the man who cut the phone lines also was responsible for the trucks that failed to start, as he was the one that could have tampered with them. However, one of George's son-in-laws in 2013 had come to believe that Sodder and his sons might have, in their haste to start the trucks, flooded the engines. Although in my opinion, that seems awfully coincidental. There's also other accounts that have suggested the wrong number phone call to the Sodder house might have also somehow been connected to the fire. However, investigators later located the woman who made the phone call, and she confirmed that it had been a wrong number on her part. As spring approached, the Sodders still grieved their lost children. However, further developments in early 1946 reinforced the family's belief that the children they were memorializing might, in fact, be alive somewhere. Given that they lived in a predominantly Italian community, George was known to be very anti-Benito Mussolini, the Italian leader of the Axis powers during World War II. Before the fire in December, in October of 1945, a visiting life insurance salesman, after being rebuffed, warned George that his house, quote, would go up in smoke and your children are going to be destroyed, attributing all this to, quote, the dirty remarks you have been making about Mussolini. Another random visitor to the house who was looking for work did take the occasion to go around to the back and warn George that a pair of fuse boxes would, quote, cause a fire someday. But George was puzzled by the observation since he had just had the house rewired when the electric stove was installed, and the local electric company had said afterwards it was safe. Also, in the weeks before Christmas that year, George's older sons had also noticed a strange car parked along the main highway through town, with its occupants observing the younger Sodder children as they returned from school. Fast forwarding back to the investigation in 1946, evidence soon emerged indicating that the fire had not started in the electrical fault and was instead set deliberately. George recalled his wife's account of the loud thump she heard on the roof before the fire, and he found something that looked like a, quote, pineapple bomb, hand grenade, or some other incendiary device used in combat. Other witnesses claimed to have seen the missing Sodder children themselves. One woman who had been watching the fire from the road said that she had seen some of them peering out of a passing car while the house was burning. Another woman at a rest stop between Fayetteville and Charleston said that she had served them breakfast the next morning and noted the presence of a car with Florida license plates in the rest stop's parking lot as well. At this point, the Sodders hired a private investigator named C.C. Tinsley from the nearby town of Golly Bridge. Tinsley informed the family that the insurance salesman who had threatened George over his anti-Mussolini sentiments had been on the coroner's jury that ruled the fire an accident, but no hard evidence could really link him to the fire. The Sodders contacted the FBI, but to no avail, and they spent the rest of their lives searching for their children, scouring the country and following up on any leads. One really interesting lead came 20 years after the fire in 1968. Jenny received a picture in the mail of a young man claiming to be Luis, but attempts to find him were fruitless. George died later on that year, and Jenny built a fence around their home and pretty much wore black until she died in 1989. And to this day, the mystery still lives on as to what happened to the 5 Sodder children after that fire. So let me know what you think in the comments below regarding this case. I know there's a lot of details out there that I'm sure I missed. It's a very interesting mystery that I hope one day gets solved. So please follow me on Twitter, and please subscribe for future content and to help grow this channel.